Leah Sanders' story begins with an incident on a plane. Despite having a confirmed first-class ticket, she was moved to economy. She tried to stay calm, but frustration broke through. Support from journalists turned the event into a bold challenge to the system, proving that even an emotional reaction can spark real change. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next story. The airport was bustling with people. The hum of conversations and loudspeaker announcements blended into a rhythmic noise that filled the space with organized chaos. Leah Sanders stood in line for boarding with a slight smile and a sense of anticipation. Today was an important day. She was heading to deliver a speech at an international human rights conference. Her presentation would shed light on the systemic injustice and inequality faced by underserved communities. In her hand was a leather briefcase with notes and a laptop filled with hours of preparation. Nearby passengers checked their tickets, lost in their own worlds, but Leah's tall frame, dark skin, and confident posture drew attention. When she stepped into the plane and took her first-class seat by the window, she allowed herself a brief breath of relief. This was her moment of calm before a storm. She pulled out her tablet, quickly scanned her notes, and made a few edits. Moments later, the senior flight attendant Amanda West approached. Her pristine hairstyle, perfectly pressed uniform, and stern expression immediately conveyed her authority and attention to detail. Yet her gaze lingered on Leah for a second too long, tinged with suspicion. Amanda slowly stepped closer and spoke with polite coldness. "Excuse me, may I see your boarding pass?" Leah glanced up, noticing the tension in her voice. Without hesitation, she reached into her bag and handed over the neatly folded ticket. Amanda studied it carefully, her expression hardening. "There appears to have been a mistake. You'll need to move to economy class," she said with a faint but firm smile. A hush fell around them as passengers nearby grew silent, ears pricked. Leah felt a chill run down her spine, but her face remained calm. "I'm sorry, but this seat is booked under my name and my ticket is confirmed," Leah replied evenly. Amanda glanced around nervously, as if looking for support from a colleague nearby. Leah knew this wasn't about the ticket. She could feel it in the way Amanda's voice sharpened. With quiet resolve, Leah stood, gathered her belongings, and began the walk toward the back. Each step was heavy with unspoken humiliation. In the economy cabin, the murmurs of passengers grew as they watched her. Leah settled into her new seat and exhaled slowly, trying to steady her breath. She reached for her phone and typed a short message to her lawyer. "Incident on board. Please document the details." An elderly woman beside her turned and whispered, "You shouldn't stay silent, dear. You deserve better than this." Those words echoed in her mind, stirring memories of a day when her silence had cost someone their life. Since then, she had sworn never to remain indifferent to injustice, neither her own nor anyone else's. But what could she do now? She knew every reaction would be scrutinized and judged. Instead of panicking, Leah sent another message, this time to her journalist colleague, Brian Torres. "There's a situation on this flight. Can you help me get the word out?" Moments later, a young flight attendant, Nina Carter, placed a glass of water on her tray and leaned in. "I saw everything," she said softly, avoiding direct eye contact. "And I'm sorry." Leah looked at her with quiet gratitude. Even in the most tense moments, there were people who chose kindness. As the plane ascended, Leah knew this was just the beginning of a battle. When her feet touched the ground again, the truth would need to come to light. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin, accompanied by the soft clinking of glassware as the attendants moved through the aisles. Outside the window, clouds drifted by like islands in a sea of light. Leah sat motionless by the window, her gaze distant, her thoughts tangled between the present and the past. Her fingers lightly touched the glass of water left by the young flight attendant, Nina Carter. A quiet gesture of support, almost invisible but meaningful. Yet it wasn't enough to extinguish the burning injustice that simmered within her. The words of the elderly woman next to her, "You're too dignified to stay silent," echoed in her mind. Leah remembered the day that had changed her life forever. It was at a medical center for low-income families. She had faced a choice: follow the system's rules or fight for her patient. She had hesitated. The patient didn't survive the system's delays and silence. Since then, she had sworn never to let injustice go unanswered. And now, sitting in the cramped economy seat, she knew this wasn't just a seat change. It was a symbol of a system that could still demean and control those who didn't fit its unspoken rules. To her left, passengers scrolled through their phones, watched movies, or dozed off to the drone of the engines. Some glanced at her, some with sympathy, others with passive curiosity. She didn't acknowledge the looks. It all seemed like background noise compared to her own thoughts, but beneath her calm exterior, resolve was building. She opened her phone and read her lawyer's message, documented. Remember, calm is your greatest strength. Leah exhaled slowly. Meanwhile, in first class, the attendants continued their routine as if nothing had happened. But Jack Hill, the senior flight attendant, felt the tension. He had known Amanda West for years and understood her obsession with order. But something was off. He noticed how passengers cast side glances toward her, while she pretended to be oblivious. This silence felt like the moment before a storm. On board, everything remained the same: smiles, offers of refreshments, formal movements. But outside the plane, the situation was already unfolding differently. Journalist Brian Torres's post was spreading online. Under the headline, "Why was a passenger with a confirmed ticket moved to economy?" comments began pouring in. People were voicing support, outrage, and curiosity, trying to understand what had happened. The airline was already aware. In the office of crisis manager Mark Reynolds, the phone rang. The news of the post was gaining momentum like a snowball. Mark opened the internal monitoring system and pulled up the first reports on reputation risks. The tension in the office was palpable. Leah didn't know the specifics but felt that her story had already started living a life of its own beyond the cabin. Her phone vibrated again, a brief notification that the post was gaining traction. She closed the screen and rested the phone on her lap, left alone with the silence that no longer felt harmless. The engines droned on steadily, but for Leah, that sound was the backdrop to her inner storm. She knew this flight was no longer just a route. It was the starting point of changes she both feared and longed for. The cabin of the economy class remained filled with the soft hum of engines and the quiet sounds of passengers flipping through pages, watching movies, or drifting off to sleep. On the surface, everything seemed calm. But for Leah, it was only an illusion of peace. Inside her, the fire of injustice burned stronger than ever. Whispers trickled through the aisles, murmurs of passengers speculating about that woman who had been moved from first class. Some dismissed it as a booking error, while others cast curious glances, their expressions tinged with either sympathy or indifference. Jack Hill, the senior flight attendant, observed the cabin with professional vigilance. He could sense when a situation was slipping from minor incident to something more serious. His instincts honed over years of experience told him that ignoring this would only escalate the issue. Jack approached the control panel and checked the seating list. Leah Sanders' name was clearly marked in the first-class section, confirming her rightful seat. His frustration simmered. There had been no mistake. This was something else entirely. With a measured breath, Jack straightened his shoulders. His professionalism was rooted in fairness, and this felt fundamentally wrong. Amanda West stood near the service counter, meticulously arranging glasses as if performing a ritual to regain her sense of control. Each movement was precise but hollow. Her gaze was unfocused as she struggled to suppress the tension creeping up her spine. Jack approached her silently and placed the passenger list in front of her. Leah's name was highlighted under first class. Amanda's face tightened when she saw it. The unspoken accusation in Jack's eyes was clear. Leah, meanwhile, focused on steadying her breath. She knew that any emotional outburst could be weaponized against her. She opened her notebook and began jotting down lines, not to document the incident, but to calm her thoughts. Her handwriting was neat, yet the swirling emotions made it hard to focus on the words. She noticed movement nearby and looked up. Nina Carter was passing through the aisle. Their eyes met briefly, and in Nina's gaze, Leah saw doubt and concern. There was a quiet plea for guidance. Leah allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't a victory, but it was a reminder, to herself and to Nina, that the truth had weight and couldn't be silenced. In the first-class cabin, silence thickened around Jack and Amanda. Jack's voice was low but sharp. You knew it was her seat. Amanda didn't meet his gaze, her shoulders slumping slightly in response. There was no defense that would stand. In the airline's crisis management office, the first call had already begun. Mark Reynolds, the reputation manager, sat at his desk, staring at reports showing the rapid rise in social media mentions. Brian Torres's post had struck a chord. Comments multiplied with each passing minute. Mark typed a message to his superiors. This situation requires immediate action. We're under intense public scrutiny. The response was swift: minimize noise. Follow standard conflict resolution protocol. Mark frowned. He knew that the usual approach wouldn't work here. When someone like Brian Torres took interest, the incident could quickly escalate to an international scale. Leah continued staring out the window, grounding herself in the rhythmic hum of the plane. Yet her mind swirled with thoughts of responsibility, truth, and the stakes at hand. This wasn't about a seat, it was about a principle. Would she surrender or stand firm for what mattered, not just to her but to countless others? She thought of her students, those who listened to her lectures on advocating for the vulnerable and resisting pressure to conform. Now, she was living the lesson she had always preached. Her phone vibrated again, a notification from Brian. His post had been picked up by several news outlets. The story was evolving in real time, shifting from an isolated incident to a public narrative. Leah took a slow breath. She knew she needed to be ready for whatever came next. The sky outside the window was calm and clear, but the tension inside the plane was growing, as if the air itself had thickened. Leah sat still, her gaze fixed on the passing clouds. Her mind was sharp, focused on every detail of the unfolding situation. She knew that the system always tried to swallow and silence those who dared to speak out. Today, she was ready to resist. In the cockpit, the captain received Jack Hill's report. The message was concise, outlining the facts. Leah Sanders had a confirmed first-class ticket. The captain understood that the situation required delicate handling and that any misstep could lead to scandal. He knew that his job wasn't just about flying, it was about maintaining order on board. But even for him, this incident felt unsettling. He relayed his instructions: avoid noise, calm the passengers. His voice came through Jack's headset, and Jack nodded silently. He knew that the reality in the cabin had already gone beyond standard protocols. Meanwhile, in the airline's office, a crisis meeting was underway. The crisis management team gathered in a conference room, their eyes fixed on the screens displaying social media metrics. Brian Torres's posts were already being discussed by thousands. Next to the graphs, a live feed of comments scrolled rapidly. This is unacceptable. Why does this still happen? And we demand answers. Everything pointed to one conclusion: the situation was quickly becoming public. Mark Reynolds stood in the center of the room, phone in hand. His face was a mix of frustration and focus. He glanced up at the screen showing Brian's post and gave a direct order: draft a statement about a technical error. We need to present this as a misunderstanding. His colleagues nodded and began typing away, carefully crafting the message. But Mark knew that words alone wouldn't be enough, especially with a journalist like Brian Torres involved. He opened his email and sent a message to the captain, requesting real-time updates on the situation. On board, the tension remained thick. Jack returned to the economy cabin and noticed that several passengers were watching Leah with curiosity, stealing glances at her from behind their screens and seats. Leah remained composed, her breathing steady. She had made her decision. She wouldn't stay silent. She understood that every move she made now was either a step toward change or a retreat into defeat. Nina Carter, the flight attendant who had shown kindness and honesty, approached Leah again and offered her another glass of water. There was genuine concern in her eyes. Leah thanked her with a slight nod but noticed that Nina lingered a second longer than necessary. Perhaps she wanted to say something but was held back by fear of being judged by her colleagues or losing her job. Leah made a mental note: even those who are on my side are trapped by the system's limits. Jack, observing this brief interaction, realized that not everyone on the crew supported Amanda West's decision. He returned to Amanda, who was standing off to the side, her arms crossed as if trying to shield herself from the situation. Her eyes were downcast, and her stiff posture betrayed the inner conflict she was trying to hide. She no longer seemed confident. Jack felt a flicker of sympathy but quickly suppressed it. His duty was to protect all passengers, without exception. While the crew tried to maintain control of the situation, the airline's leadership was preparing to contain the fallout. A plan was put in place to invite Leah for a private discussion immediately after landing and offer her significant compensation to remain silent. The customer relations team received instructions to act courteously but firmly. Nina overheard the conversation over the cabin intercom and understood that the airline had no intention of acknowledging its mistake publicly. She approached Jack, her voice low and cautious as she informed him of what she'd heard. Jack listened without interrupting, but his clenched jaw revealed his frustration. He knew that if Leah accepted a compromise, the truth would be buried under layers of corporate spin. Finally, he stepped toward Leah and, leaning in slightly, quietly said, "They might offer you a deal. Think twice before accepting." Leah nodded, but her eyes gleamed with unwavering determination. She already knew what her answer would be. She sat still, like a rock in the middle of a rushing river, as the waves of events swirled around her. This moment reminded her that truth always comes at a cost. Every movement on board became part of a larger conflict. The smallest details, the flicker in Nina's gaze, Jack's heavy step, Amanda's slumped shoulders, spoke louder than words. This was the moment when the true nature of everyone involved was laid bare. Leah knew that if she stayed silent now, she would lose more than just a seat. She would lose the values she had lived by. She took a deep breath, and despite all the anxiety, she exhaled with a sense of steady certainty. The truth was on her side. But she knew that ahead lay a challenge she had been preparing for her entire life. This flight was no longer just about a trip from point A to point B. It had become a battle for dignity and justice. The plane began its descent. The captain announced the approach to landing, and passengers started gathering their belongings and adjusting their seats upright. But for Leah, this flight was far from over. Her thoughts were focused on the next steps, what the airline's management would do to save face and what cards she had left to play. In the airline's office, Mark Reynolds signed off on the press release. It spoke of its technical glitch in the seat assignment system and mentioned immediate measures to review internal protocols. The wording was carefully crafted to deflect blame while projecting a commitment to customer service. Yet Mark felt a gnawing doubt. It wouldn't be enough. He knew that once journalists reached eyewitnesses, the full truth would come to light, and the airline would be exposed to intense public scrutiny. On board, a flight attendant approached Leah with a polite smile that barely hid her instructions. "After landing, you'll be asked to join us for a discussion regarding the incident," she said, trying to sound neutral. Leah nodded but felt a flicker of unease. She knew such discussions rarely led to anything other than an attempt to make her story disappear. As soon as the plane touched down and taxied to the terminal, passengers began gathering their bags and filing out. Some cast quick glances at Leah, filled with curiosity and sympathy. One person whispered, "Stay strong," but the atmosphere remained muted, as if the storm had merely shifted to the horizon. Leah stayed seated, allowing the crowd to leave first. She didn't want to draw unnecessary attention. At that moment, Brian Torres appeared at the entrance to the economy section. His face was serious, his gaze steady and supportive. "Don't agree to anything without your lawyer," he said quietly, pretending to adjust his jacket. "Offers like that are traps." Leah met his gaze and gave a slight nod, feeling the weight of his words as a lifeline. She remembered countless cases where people accepted compromises, hoping to avoid conflict, only for their stories to fade into obscurity. At the jet bridge, a man in a formal suit greeted her. He introduced himself as a legal representative of the airline and politely asked Leah to follow him to a private meeting room. Everything was presented with professional courtesy, but the intent was clear: to contain the situation before it grew further. Leah followed him with steady posture, though her heartbeat quickened. She knew this meeting would test her principles. The negotiation room was small and sterile, furnished with soft chairs, a glass table, and neatly placed folders bearing the airline's logo. It was designed to convey trustworthiness. When the door closed, Mark Reynolds joined the meeting via video call. His expression was calm, but tension flickered in his eyes. He began with a carefully rehearsed apology. "We deeply regret the inconvenience. The company values every passenger and strives to correct any errors." After a pause for effect, Mark added, "We're prepared to offer compensation, including free flights and a monetary bonus." Leah's expression remained calm but resolute. She knew that accepting such an offer would reduce her story to just another case of corporate cleanup. Folding her hands on her lap, she replied evenly, "I'm not here for bonuses. I'm here to make sure the truth is heard." On the other side of the screen, Mark exhaled, as though he had anticipated this response but still hoped for a different outcome. He glanced at an off-screen assistant, who nodded and jotted something down. "We'll conduct an internal investigation," Mark continued, though his tone had lost some of its confidence. "We'll ensure this doesn't happen again." Leah felt the emptiness of his promises. True change didn't come from within corporations. It came from external pressure from those who refused to be silenced. Outside the negotiation room, the hashtag Justice for Leah was already trending, with thousands of posts circulating. Supporters shared and commented, amplifying the story to new heights. Near the door, Nina Carter and Jack stood side by side, speaking in hushed tones. "She won't back down," Nina murmured, her hands clenched into fists. Jack nodded, his expression a blend of respect and concern. "And she shouldn't." When the meeting concluded, Leah walked out with a newfound sense of clarity. She had rejected the silent settlement, knowing that her refusal would spark something larger. Her demeanor was calm, but in her heart, a new fire burned, the fire of purpose and the determination to see this through. When Leah stepped out of the negotiation room, the sunlight streaming through the terminal's glass walls momentarily blinded her. But instead of overwhelming her, it sharpened her sense of purpose. Around her, people bustled with suitcases in hand, reuniting with loved ones, filling the space with chatter and movement. Yet for Leah, it all felt like background noise. Her thoughts were focused on one goal. Justice had to prevail, and she wasn't going to stop. As she made her way toward the exit, she caught sight of Brian Torres. He was standing nearby, scrolling through his phone. When he noticed her, he gave her a slight nod of acknowledgement, a reminder that the world was already waiting for the truth. "People want answers," he murmured as she passed him. But Leah knew that the truth didn't just reveal itself. It had to be built from clear facts, actions, and the courage of those willing to go the distance. Meanwhile, social media platforms were lighting up with posts under the hashtag Justice for Leah. The story had gone viral in a matter of hours. People shared their thoughts, their outrage, and even their personal stories of injustice. Passengers from the flight added their own accounts of what they had witnessed. The public outcry was no longer confined to the internet. Bloggers, independent reporters, and even news outlets had picked up the story. Investigations were underway, and every comment, every witness statement became another piece of a growing puzzle that painted a clearer picture of the truth. Nina Carter stood near the staff exit, scrolling through her phone. Her heart raced as conflicting emotions surged within her, fear of retaliation and the realization that her silence could be the deciding factor. She knew that her testimony could change everything, but it meant stepping out of the shadows and risking her career. Behind her, Jack's footsteps echoed as he approached. His stride was heavy but deliberate. "Don't you think it's time to speak up?" he asked calmly, meeting her gaze. Nina hesitated for a few seconds, then finally whispered, "If we stay silent, the truth will drown." An hour after Leah left the negotiation room, she received a message on her phone. "We're ready to air the story. We stand with you." It was from an independent news agency known for its hard-hitting exposés. Leah didn't hesitate. She knew this was her chance to set the record straight. But she also understood that every step she took from now on would be under the public's watchful eye. Taking a deep breath, she accepted the invitation. At the airline's headquarters, chaos reigned. Mark Reynolds paced his office, issuing frantic instructions. His team scrambled to rewrite statements and adjust strategies, but the tide had turned. The stream of information couldn't be contained. Journalists had found their leads, and the cracks in the company's facade were widening. Reports began to highlight not only Leah's case but also systemic issues in customer service, long-standing blind spots, and entrenched biases. Leah arrived at a small newsroom for her interview. The questions were sharp but fair. She answered confidently, sticking to the facts. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a sign that the system is failing. Every word she spoke carried weight. The interview was broadcasted within hours, accompanied by footage from the airport and passenger statements. The video quickly gained hundreds of thousands of views. At the same time, Nina Carter made a bold move. She posted a detailed account on her social media, describing the situation as she had witnessed it and revealing the conversation she overheard about keeping things quiet. It was a risky step, but for Nina, it was liberating. Meanwhile, the flight captain and other crew members, including Jack, were giving their statements to the disciplinary committee. They emphasized that the situation could have been resolved on board if not for Amanda West's insistence. When Amanda was summoned for questioning, she hesitated before finally speaking. "I thought I was maintaining order." It was instinct, misguided, but genuine. But her words sounded more like an excuse than genuine remorse. With the company facing mounting pressure, Mark Reynolds was forced to resign. The airline issued an official press release apologizing and committing to revising its internal policies. This day marked the beginning of the end for those who believed that systems couldn't change. Leah not only proved the opposite but showed that one voice could be the catalyst for transformation. She knew that the fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of relief. Her struggle had made a difference. As the dust of the scandal began to settle, Leah realized that her story had transcended her personal struggle. Every step she took and every word she spoke now resonated with thousands of people around the world. She stared at her phone as notifications of support flooded in, messages from strangers, emails from colleagues, and even rare acknowledgments from those who had once doubted her. But amidst the flood of encouraging words, Leah felt an odd emptiness. Ahead of her was the conference where she was scheduled to speak. Her presentation had originally been focused on healthcare programs for underserved communities. But now, she knew people were expecting her to speak about justice and resilience. She sat in front of the mirror in her hotel room, rehearsing her opening lines in her head. But her voice sounded too flat, almost lifeless. She stopped and stared at her reflection. Beneath the exhaustion in her eyes, there was still a glimmer of fire, the reminder of why she had taken this risk. When Leah stepped onto the stage and looked out at the audience, time seemed to slow. The room was packed, hundreds of eyes filled with anticipation. The applause that greeted her entrance felt distant, like an echo. Why does the truth have to come at such a high price? She thought for a brief second before shaking the thought away and refocusing on her speech. She spoke calmly, without theatrics, anchoring her words in facts. "I stepped forward not because of a personal vendetta. My story is just an example of how the system can break in unexpected ways. And we need to remember, we are all part of that system. We either uphold it through silence or change it through action." Her words pierced the silence, and no one in the room remained indifferent. When she finished, there was a standing ovation, but Leah once again felt that familiar bitterness. She knew that countless similar stories remained unheard. This moment of victory was significant, but it couldn't erase the deeper injustice overnight. Nina Carter sat in the back row of the conference hall, a quiet smile on her face as she watched Leah. Her own choice, to speak out online, had not only changed public perception but had also transformed her life. The airline had acknowledged her courage, and shortly after the incident, she had been offered a position as a mentor for new flight attendants. It wasn't a promotion for the sake of a title, it was a responsibility she took seriously. Meanwhile, Amanda West was undergoing retraining and reorientation. Her pride hadn't disappeared, but she had learned to see events from a different perspective. One of the training assignments was to write a letter to those whose lives had been affected by your decisions. Amanda stared at the blank page for a long time before she began to write, "Leah, thank you for not letting me hide behind my pride. Your example taught me to see people differently." At the same time, Brian Torres published an article titled "Leah Sanders, Defying Fear and the System." He wrote not only about the incident itself but also about those who remained steadfast in their commitment to the truth, even when it cost them their careers or comfort. His words were sharp yet inspiring. Leah Sanders didn't just endure the blow, she broke the silence. But despite the headlines and hundreds of reposts, Leah knew her story was only the beginning. She accepted the congratulations and questions, but her thoughts drifted toward the future. There were still many tasks ahead: reforms within the airline, supporting other passengers, and helping those who hadn't yet dared to speak up. However, there were also consequences that lingered like a shadow. Relocations, an endless stream of journalists, skeptical questions, and even threats from those who saw her actions as a challenge to the established order. It was an inevitable path for someone who had decided to fight the system. And though her life had been irrevocably changed, she felt an inner freedom she had once only dreamed of. After the conference, Nina approached Leah with a warm smile and said, "You didn't just tell your story, you made people think. You changed me." Leah looked at her and replied, "You were part of this too. Without your voice, none of this would have been possible." Meanwhile, Amanda finished her letter, folded it carefully, and placed it in an envelope with a quiet resolution that her new chapter would begin with accepting her mistakes. Several weeks had passed since Leah's conference speech, but the echoes of it hadn't faded. Questions about reforms, fairness, and new service standards remained on people's minds. Leading news channels debated the aftermath of her story, advocacy groups called for inclusivity programs, and her name continued to appear in headlines around the world. But with recognition came a new wave of challenges. One of the first tests was an invitation to speak at an international human rights forum. This event would not only be a personal milestone for Leah but also a test of whether she could remain true to her principles under the watchful eyes of world leaders and journalists. She knew there was no room for error. Any misstep could undermine everything she had worked for. The day of the trip was particularly cold and rainy. Leah watched the raindrops trickling down the taxi window, feeling a mix of confidence and doubt. In her mind, a quiet voice repeated, "You've come this far. Is there any reason to stop now?" When she arrived at the airport, she was handed a special invitation for premium service, a gesture of recognition from the airline. But Leah declined. Privileges should never be an excuse for silence, she reminded herself as she walked through the regular passenger line with everyone else. In the check-in queue, Leah spotted a familiar face. It was Nina Carter, now not just a flight attendant but a mentor for new hires, helping them avoid past mistakes. Her smile radiated genuine warmth. As Leah approached, Nina spoke with a slight tremor in her voice. "Your story didn't just change my life, it changed the way we work." Leah nodded in gratitude. Her eyes lit up with the resolve that kept her moving forward despite the hardships. Meanwhile, the airline had not only implemented mandatory inclusivity courses for all employees but also introduced a feedback system where passengers could openly share their service experiences. These measures received widespread attention, though reactions were mixed. Some praised the changes, while others dismissed them as performative gestures. Leah knew that reforms were always a battle between intent and perception. Journalists continued to follow her every move, and rumors that she had turned down a large compensation in favor of a charitable donation spread quickly. Reports were filled with headlines like, "True leadership, turning down personal gain." While many admired her decision, others questioned it. Why reject what's rightfully hers? For Leah, the answer was simple: it was never about the money. Between meetings and public appearances, Leah stayed connected with those who had supported her from the beginning. She maintained correspondence with Nina, kept in touch with Brian Torres, and received occasional but heartfelt letters from Amanda West, who was still undergoing retraining. One such letter began with the line, "It took me a while to understand that you showed me not weakness but strength." Learning to accept mistakes has been the hardest lesson. But alongside these moments of support, shadows lingered. Some participants in public discussions accused Leah of seeking media attention, claiming she was capitalizing on her story. Occasionally, articles would appear with sarcastic commentary that the Truth Star was becoming a symbol of exhausting self-righteousness. Leah understood that the path of change was rarely straightforward and that every step required both internal and external strength. Despite this, her belief in people remained steadfast. She believed that even amidst criticism and attacks, there were those who would change their perspective when they saw genuine progress. She also knew it would take more than one person to change the system. That's why she remained committed to helping others who faced injustice, even if their stories didn't make the headlines. Leah soon received an invitation to join the advisory council of an international human rights organization dedicated to developing fair service recommendations across various industries. This invitation was a sign that her efforts resonated not only with individuals but also within global institutions. One evening, as Leah returned home after a long day of interviews and meetings, she noticed children in the park playing with paper airplanes, their laughter filling the air. The moment reminded her of a simple truth: the fight for justice isn't just about accountability and regulations, it's about creating a future for those who will one day face their own choices. The day after returning home, Leah opened her mailbox and found a letter bearing the official seal of the International Human Rights Council. The invitation confirmed her attendance at a private meeting to discuss reforms in passenger service and client relations in transportation. It was another step forward, but Leah knew it also marked the beginning of a new challenge. She couldn't afford to rest. Her story had become a symbol for those whose voices hadn't been heard. Before her trip, Leah gathered her notes and reviewed her documents. In the margins of her notebook, her hand had unconsciously written the phrase, "Justice is not a word, it's an action." She sighed and closed the folder. Deep inside, the fatigue from endless discussions, justifications, and public appearances lingered. But her resolve remained unchanged. She had to keep going. The airport felt familiar yet different since Leah's story became public. The staff at the check-in counters and the flight crew seemed to look at passengers differently, not as tickets or seat numbers but as people with stories that mattered. Leah watched as a young flight attendant assisted a passenger with a disability, and warmth filled her chest. Small changes started with significant efforts. As Leah boarded the flight to the council meeting, she saw a familiar figure at the entrance. It was Nina Carter, now standing tall in her uniform with an air of confidence. Nina's smile was as warm and genuine as ever, but now it reminded Leah of the power of simple human respect. "Your seat is ready," Nina said with a slight nod. "And just know, because of you, this job is no longer just about rules and regulations." Nina's words made Leah smile. For the first time in a long while, she felt that her efforts were yielding not just publicity but real change. She walked to her seat in economy class, despite being offered a place in first. For Leah, it was a matter of principle, a reminder of why she had begun this journey. During the flight, Leah opened her laptop and began drafting an article for a major news outlet. The theme was simple: small steps, big change. She described how systems, despite their sluggishness, could change if people believed in them and didn't shy away from difficulties. There was no blame or grandstanding in her writing, just facts and observations. She ended the article with the words, "Every step toward justice is a choice to see the person behind the ticket, the name, or the mistake." Upon landing, Leah noticed a group of reporters gathered at the exit, waiting to ask questions and get comments about her upcoming council appearance. Instead of taking a separate exit, she approached them and calmly said, "I have nothing to hide. You'll find all the answers in my actions." Her response was short but precise, sparking conversations without creating sensationalism, just confidence and clarity. In the council hall, silence reigned as Leah entered. Representatives from around the world, experts, advocates, and researchers, waited for her presentation. She understood that this wasn't just a meeting but a moment where her words could lay the foundation for significant change. Beginning with a brief recounting of events, Leah moved on to her core message. We need reforms that aren't performative but built on mutual respect and dialogue. Every example in her speech reminded the audience of real people who had faced bias. The room was enveloped in a profound silence. Everyone was listening intently. When the meeting concluded, Leah felt a sense of relief. During the break, a council representative approached her and extended a hand. "Your words reminded us why we began this work. Thank you for your courage." But the most unexpected turn came that evening in her hotel room when Leah found a letter from Amanda West. Amanda had written, sometimes you have to face your own defeat to understand the value of change. Thank you for not letting me stay the same. However, at the end of the letter, Amanda confessed, I've been dismissed without the possibility of reinstatement as a flight attendant. It's painful, but perhaps it's the punishment I deserve. Now, I want to find a path where my mistakes become lessons, not a permanent stain. These words carried the weight of bitter but honest acceptance. Leah stared at the lines for a long time, feeling a mix of emotions. It was a sign that the system doesn't always repair, it teaches. Amanda could have walked away with resentment, but instead, she chose humility and a quest for redemption. Leah's journey had been long and arduous, but every step brought her closer to a world where justice was no longer an abstract goal but a reality for all. The morning sun streamed through the thin curtains of Leah's hotel room, bathing everything in golden light. This day was special, all the meetings and speeches were finally over, and she had a rare chance to pause and reflect on her journey. Leah sat by the window with a cup of coffee, watching airplanes glide across the runway. There was something symbolic about their movement, like her own path, filled with takeoffs and turbulent landings. She opened her laptop and began rereading the draft of her new article. The piece, which she had postponed for a long time, was about how real change starts with small actions. Each sentence reminded her of the people whose lives had become intertwined with her story. She added the final line, sometimes, one voice is enough to give others the courage to speak up. After saving the document, she closed her laptop and took a deep breath. Outside, a small crowd began to gather near the hotel entrance. These weren't reporters with cameras, but ordinary passengers, activists, and people who had come to say thank you. Leah approached the window and noticed someone holding a sign that read, "Justice is not a destination, it's a process." The words resonated deeply within her. When she came downstairs, the people greeted her with warm smiles and greetings. Someone handed her a letter sharing their personal story. Someone else gave her a small pin shaped like a paper airplane. Leah felt less like a hero and more like a part of a larger movement that was growing stronger. Later at the airport, she was once again greeted by Nina Carter, glowing with her usual kindness. "Looks like we're traveling together again," Nina said with a smile. "Thank you for showing us that kindness and professionalism aren't just rules, they're choices." In that moment, Leah felt a strange peace. For the first time in many months, there was no anxiety or doubt in her heart. Her story no longer belonged to her alone. It had become a symbol of change that inspired others. As Leah boarded the plane and took her seat by the window, she closed her eyes for a moment and allowed herself to remember every important step of her journey. She recalled how she first contacted her lawyer, how journalist Brian Torres made her story known to the world, how Nina had supported her despite the risks. And even Amanda, despite her mistakes, had found the strength to change her path. The familiar hum of the cabin filled the air, the shuffle of feet, crew announcements, the crackle of the intercom. Everything seemed ordinary, but Leah knew that behind this routine hum was the quiet labor of those who now saw passengers as more than just numbers in a system. She opened her eyes and noticed a young flight attendant helping an elderly woman find her seat, listening carefully to her needs. Leah smiled. This simple but meaningful gesture proved that change was possible. During the flight, Leah pulled out Amanda West's letter and reread it. The words, "Thank you for not letting me stay the same," resonated deeply. The letter was proof that even the most tangled paths could lead to understanding and growth. When the plane landed, Leah slowly exited the cabin and made her way to the terminal. As she walked, one of the passengers passing by quietly said, "Your example opened many eyes." Leah nodded in gratitude and continued walking, feeling light with every step. Shortly after returning home, she received an offer to join the Human Rights Council on a permanent basis. It was a recognition of her efforts, but Leah knew that this new role wasn't a reward, it was another opportunity to make a difference. She accepted without hesitation. Weeks passed, and Leah returned to her daily routine. But now, every day began with the awareness that her voice had truly made a difference. In the park near her house, children played with paper airplanes, laughing and running along the paths. Leah watched them and understood that her story wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a new journey.